Picture a young boy, Timothy Ferguson, a life that should have been full of joy and discovery, instead marred with unimaginable cruelty. This story begins with Timothy's father, a man whose interest in his son was as fleeting as a shooting star in the night sky. He was a man who, for reasons unbeknownst to us, decided that his son was a burden too great, a responsibility he was unwilling to shoulder. And so he handed Timothy off to his mother, a woman who, by law, was not permitted to have custody of him. Now you may be wondering why a mother would be denied custody of her own child. It's a question that nags at the back of our minds as we delve deeper into this heart-wrenching tale. The mother, a recent law school graduate, was a woman shrouded in mystery and contradiction. On the surface, she was a promising professional carving her path in the world of law. But beneath this facade, she harbored a darkness that would cast a long, haunting shadow over Timothy's life. Then, there was Timothy's older brother, a character who played a pivotal role in this grim narrative. He was the one who, under the guidance of their mother, would ensure that Timothy was subjected to unthinkable torment. In the midst of these characters and their twisted family dynamic, Timothy was but a young boy, innocent and unaware of the cruel world that lay before him. He was a child who should have been learning about the world, making friends, and dreaming about his future. Instead, he was trapped in a nightmare that was far from over. Little did Timothy know, his life was about to take a turn for the worse. This is where our unfortunate tale truly begins. A tale of a boy who was failed not only by those closest to him, but also by the very system that was supposed to protect him. As Timothy's life was hijacked by his mother and older brother, he found himself in chains, both literal and metaphorical. The small room, void of light, became Timothy's world. The walls, cold and unfeeling, seemed to close in on him, the air stale and heavy with despair. The chains that bound him were not just physical, but emotional, a stark reminder of the isolation he felt in this cruel world. His stomach gnawed with hunger, a constant companion in the darkness. The pangs were a steady rhythm in the symphony of his suffering, a bitter melody that echoed in the silent room. His meals were far and few between, each one smaller than the last, barely enough to sustain a young boy. His body began to wither, the skin clinging tightly to his bones as his vitality slipped away. The abuse he endured was not only physical. His mother and brother, the very people who should have been his protectors, were his tormentors. The harsh words they hurled at him were as sharp as knives, cutting deep into his spirit, leaving him feeling worthless and alone. The emotional torture was as relentless as the physical, an unending cycle of degradation and humiliation. A small room, a kingdom of shadows, became a prison for Timothy. Each day was a battle for survival, each night a torment of nightmares and fear. The fear was like a living entity in the room, wrapping its cold tendrils around him and squeezing until he could hardly breathe. He lived in constant terror, not knowing when the next blow would come, when the next insult would be thrown. This was Timothy's world, a world of darkness, a world of pain. His existence was reduced to a mere shadow of a life marked by suffering and despair. In the midst of this horrifying ordeal, Timothy's existence became a blur of pain and fear. While Timothy suffered in silence, there were institutions that should have noticed his disappearance. A child vanishes into thin air, and yet the alarm bells remain silent. How does this happen? Timothy's school, a place of learning and growth, became a stage of his erasure. One day he was there, among his peers, and the next he was not. The absence of a student should have been a red flag. It should have triggered questions, inquiries, and investigations. But it didn't. The school system, an institution designed to protect and educate our children, failed Timothy. Next, we come to his doctor, a figure of trust and care. Regular checkups, routine appointments, they all ceased. Yet, the doctor's office didn't raise an eyebrow. A child's health is paramount, and any deviation from the norm should warrant concern. But Timothy's absence from the doctor's office was met with silence. Lastly, his residents. Neighbors, community members, people who saw Timothy day in and day out, suddenly didn't. The cheery boy who once played in the neighborhood was nowhere to be seen. In a community where everyone knows everyone, how did Timothy's disappearance go unnoticed? The silence of his neighbors, their lack of curiosity, speaks volumes about our societal apathy. In each of these instances, there were opportunities to intervene, to question, to save Timothy. Yet the silence prevailed. Was it ignorance or was it indifference? The answer, unfortunately, doesn't change the outcome. But it does raise a crucial question about our institutional and societal responsibilities. Timothy's story is not just a tale of personal tragedy. It's a glaring testament to the systemic failures that allowed his suffering to persist unnoticed. It's a reminder that our institutions, those designed to safeguard our most vulnerable, can sometimes fail them in the most catastrophic ways. In the silence of these institutions, Timothy's pleas for help were lost. But his story, his suffering, must not be forgotten. It must serve as a stark reminder of the silent witnesses who could have and should have done something. Ironically, the orchestrator of this heinous crime was a recent law school graduate, working as a law clerk for a judge. A woman whose profession revolved around the law was the mastermind behind Timothy's torment. A chilling fact that leaves us questioning the very essence of justice in our society. As a law clerk, she was well versed in the intricacies of the law. She was aware of the rights every individual is entitled to, the protections provided to children, yet she chose to disregard all of these in favor of her sadistic inclinations. She used her knowledge of the law not to protect, but to inflict harm. Instead of being a guardian of justice, she became an agent of cruelty. The mother, while at work, sent text messages to Timothy's older brother. These weren't ordinary texts. They were directives, ensuring the continuation of Timothy's torture. Can you imagine the audacity? As she sat in an office where laws were interpreted and justice was served, she was plotting a child's torment. She knew the law and she manipulated it, exploiting its loopholes and gray areas. She understood the system well enough to keep Timothy's suffering hidden from the prying eyes of authorities. She used her legal acumen to orchestrate a crime that would remain undetected until it was too late. Her role wasn't passive. She wasn't a mere bystander who turned a blind eye to the abuse happening under her roof. She was an active participant, a puppeteer pulling the strings. She was a mother who failed not only in her duty to protect her child, but also in her capacity as a law professional. It's a disturbing reality that the very people who should uphold the law can sometimes be the ones to break it. The ones we trust to protect the vulnerable can become their worst nightmares. This is a stark reminder that the law, in the wrong hands, can be a tool for harm rather than a shield for protection. In an ironic twist of fate, the very law that should have protected Timothy was being used against him. In the end, the torture proved too much for young Timothy. The final chapter of Timothy's short life is a tragic one. This innocent child, who should have been exploring the world, making friends and living a normal life, was instead subjected to unimaginable torment. The small room in which he was confined became his world, a world filled with fear, pain, and despair. After enduring months of abuse and neglect, Timothy's frail body finally gave in. His life was extinguished, not by a sudden accident or a lingering illness, but by the cruel and deliberate actions of those who were supposed to protect him. When his lifeless body was discovered, it was a chilling reminder of the horrific conditions he had been forced to endure. The news of Timothy's death sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors, teachers, friends, those who had known him, even if only briefly, were left grappling with disbelief and grief. The media took up his story, spreading it far and wide. Headlines screamed about the brutality of his ordeal, the failure of the systems that should have protected him, and the chilling complicity of his own family. Timothy's death stirred up a storm of outrage and sorrow. Candlelight vigils were held in his memory. His name was spoken in hushed tones, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. His story was a horrifying testament to the depths of human cruelty and the failure of the institutions that were meant to safeguard the most vulnerable among us. But as the initial shock began to fade, Timothy's story also sparked a broader conversation. It became a symbol of a broken system, a rallying cry for reform. It forced us to confront uncomfortable questions about how such an atrocity could have happened, and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. Timothy's life was cut short, but the questions his tragic story raises are far from over. Timothy's tragic story is a stark reminder of the flaws in our court system. It leaves us grappling with questions that are as uncomfortable as they are necessary. How could someone so vulnerable disappear from school, from his doctor, and from his residence without a trace? How could a system designed to protect the most vulnerable among us let Timothy down so severely? The court system, a cornerstone of our society, was meant to uphold justice and protect the rights of individuals. Yet, in Timothy's case, it failed. His father was allowed to relinquish custody to a mother deemed unfit, despite legal restrictions. This raises questions about the checks and balances in place, or rather, the lack thereof. And what about the oversight? Where were the social workers, the school officials, the community members who should have noticed Timothy's absence? The lack of oversight is glaring. It's a grim reminder that our system is not infallible, and that we must remain vigilant, questioning, and proactive to prevent such tragedies from repeating themselves. Then, there are the loopholes. How was Timothy's mother, a law clerk with a recent law degree, able to manipulate the system to her advantage? How was she able to coordinate such a horrifying ordeal while working in the very system that should have protected Timothy? This suggests that there are gaps in our legal framework that need to be addressed. Finally, we must ask ourselves, how many more children like Timothy are out there? How many more are slipping through the cracks of our court system, unseen and unheard? These are the questions that haunt us, that demand answers and action. It is our duty to ensure that Timothy's story is not forgotten and that such failures of the system are not repeated. We must confront these questions head-on, seek answers, and work tirelessly to reform the system. Because no child should suffer as Timothy did. No child should be left unprotected. We must remember Timothy, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of a system that requires reform. Timothy's story, as tragic as it is not an isolated incident. It is a stark reminder of the urgent need for change in our societal and legal systems. His life and untimely death should serve as a rallying cry for everyone who believes in the sanctity of human life and in the rights of a child to live free from fear, abuse, and neglect. We need to ask ourselves, how can we prevent another Timothy? The answer lies in the power of collective action. Each one of us has a role to play. We can start by supporting changes in law. Our legal systems need to be more vigilant, more proactive. Legislation should be put in place to ensure that children do not fall through the cracks. Laws need to be stricter for those who abuse and neglect children, and penalties need to be severe enough to act as a deterrent. In addition to changes in law, we also need to create a culture where child abuse is not tolerated. This means spreading awareness about the signs of child abuse and teaching people how to respond when they suspect a child is in danger. Child abuse thrives in silence and secrecy. Let's break that silence. Educate yourself and others about the signs of child abuse. Physical signs like unexplained injuries or consistent hunger are obvious, but emotional signs are often overlooked. These could be sudden changes in behavior, fear of certain places or people, or even overly compliant behavior. And if you suspect a child is being abused, don't hesitate to report it. You might be the only person who can help. Remember, it's better to be safe than sorry. You could be the difference between a child's life of suffering or a chance at a brighter future. Let's also focus on supporting organizations and initiatives that work towards preventing child abuse. These organizations provide resources, aid, and intervention for children at risk. They need our support, whether it's through donations, volunteering, or simply spreading the word about their work. Lastly, let's remember to listen to children. They often have their own ways of communicating their fears and anxieties. Let's create safe spaces for them to express themselves, and let's assure them that they are heard and that they matter. In memory of Timothy, let us strive for a world where no child is left unheard, unnoticed, or unprotected. Let's ensure that Timothy's story continues to echo, not as a tale of despair, but as a beacon of hope and change. Let's make sure that his life, however short, was not in vain. Let's remember Timothy, and in his memory, let's strive for a world that is kinder, safer, and more just for every child.